The old man didn't move when the forklift clipped the shelf 3 feet above his head. He just looked up, assessed the damage with the kind of calm that takes decades to earn, and went back to sweeping. That was the moment Corporal Dwayne Ashford noticed him. Really noticed him. Not the way you notice furniture, which is how most of the warehouse crew treated the old janitor who showed up at 5 every morning and was always gone before the lunch rush. Ashford noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit, a detail that your training-sharpened instincts flag before your conscious mind catches up. The old man's name, according to the laminated badge clipped to his grey coveralls, was Frank. Just Frank. No last name. The shift supervisor, a barrel-chested man named Gary Lepage, had once explained with a shrug that HR had his full file somewhere, but Frank liked it simple. "He's been here longer than me," Lepage had said, "and I've been here 11 years. Frank was somewhere north of 70. His face carried the kind of weathering that comes not from age alone, but from sustained exposure to conditions that most people only read about. Deep lines around his eyes, a jaw that had probably been square and hard once, and was now softer but no less deliberate. He moved through the warehouse with an economy of motion that Ashford, 26 years old and fresh off a second tour in Kandahar, recognized immediately. It was the walk of someone who had spent years in environments where unnecessary movement got people killed. Ashford had taken the logistics job at the Cold Lake Distribution Center 6 weeks earlier. His physiotherapist said the light work would help his knee. His mother said the routine would help his head. Neither of them was entirely wrong. The job was honest and quiet, and most of his co-workers were decent people who didn't ask him too many questions about why he sometimes stood with his back to the wall during breaks, or why he always counted exits when he entered a room. Frank never asked him anything at all, but sometimes, when Ashford arrived in the pre-dawn dark and found the old man already at work, they would exchange a nod that felt like a full sentence. The morning everything changed started the way most mornings did, with weak coffee from the machine near the loading bay and the sound of transport trucks reversing into the dock. Ashford was on inventory. Frank was running a mop across the concrete floor near the east corridor when a group of 4 reservists came through on what was supposed to be a logistics partnership visit. Young guys, early 20s, in their service dress. Their sergeant was a man named Corporal Martin Lefevre, which Ashford privately thought was like being called acting assistant manager of a company that didn't technically exist. Lefevre was 23 and had the confidence of someone who had passed every course he'd ever taken and never once been in a situation where courses stopped mattering. Lefevre saw Frank mopping near the corridor entrance and slowed down, smiling at his group in that way young men do when they've spotted an opportunity for entertainment at someone else's expense. "Hey, old-timer," he called out. "You ever serve?" Frank didn't stop mopping. "Long time ago," he said. Lefevre's smile widened. He glanced back at his guys. "What branch? Army, infantry, among other things?" Lefevre actually laughed at that, among other things. It was the kind of answer that a warehouse janitor might give if he was trying to seem interesting. Vague enough to mean nothing, broad enough to avoid being questioned. The kind of answer, in other words, that invited ridicule from people who thought specificity was a measure of credibility. "What regiment?" one of the others asked. "His name tag said Brisson." He was grinning. Frank looked at him for a moment. Just looked. The way you look at something you're deciding whether to engage with or walk around. "2nd Battalion," he said. "1st Canadian Infantry Brigade." Lefevre tilted his head. "When was that?" 68 to 81. Something shifted in Lefevre's expression. Not respect, not yet. More like mild recalculation. 13 years of service wasn't nothing. But he pushed on, because he was 23 and his guys were watching. "You see any action?" Frank stopped mopping. He turned and looked at Corporal Lefevre with eyes that Ashford, watching from 15 feet away near a shelf of boxed machinery parts, would later describe to his physiotherapist as the most unsettling thing he had encountered since coming home. Not threatening, not angry, just extremely, completely patient. "Some," Frank said. Brisson Stage whispered something to the man beside him. Ashford couldn't catch the words, but he caught the tone. It was the tone of young men who have decided that an old janitor's modesty is actually ignorance, that some action means a 6-week peacekeeping rotation and a good pension story. Ashford set down his clipboard. He walked over, not fast, just steady, the way he moved when he was trying not to escalate something he hadn't yet assessed. "You were 2nd Battalion?" he asked Frank. ignoring Lefebvre entirely. Frank glanced at him. Something in the old man's assessment lasted about 2 seconds, quick and complete, the kind of look that catalogues rank, bearing and trauma history without asking about any of them. "That's right," he said. "Cyprus?" Ashford asked. "Because 2nd Battalion, late 60s, early 70s, that's where they were." Frank's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Among other places," he said. Lefebvre cut back in, still smiling but with an edge of irritation now that someone had interrupted his entertainment. "What was your trade?" he asked, using the Canadian Army term the way someone uses a password to establish membership in a club they assume the other person doesn't belong to. Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, simply and quietly, "Infantry reconnaissance. Later, special operations." The smile on Lefebvre's face flickered. Ashford went still. Special operations wasn't a phrase you used casually in this country. You used it carefully, or you didn't use it, because the men who had actually been there rarely used it at all. "What unit?" Ashford asked. And his voice had changed. He didn't know it had changed, but Lefebvre heard it and went quiet. Frank looked at the floor for a moment, then at Ashford. "Joint Task Force 2, he said. Before it had that name. Corporal Lefebvre's clipboard slipped in his hand. He caught it, but barely. Joint Task Force 2. Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit. Classified operations. No press. No ceremonies. Men who spent their careers in the space between what governments admitted to and what they actually needed done. Before it had that name meant he predated 1993, which meant he was operating in the era when Canada's special operations capacity was a ghost that even most of the Canadian Armed Forces didn't officially know existed. "What was your designation?" Ashford asked, because he was past the point of pretending this was small talk. Frank looked at him for a long moment. He had the look of a man who has kept a lid on a container for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to open it. "They called me Ironwood," he said. Ashford sat down on a nearby crate. He sat down because his knee made a reasonable argument that standing was a bad idea, and because his brain needed 30 seconds to catch up with his instincts had already understood. Ironwood. He had heard that name once in a forward operating base in Kandahar, spoken by a warrant officer who had been drinking bad coffee at 3 in the morning and was telling the kind of stories that men tell at 3 in the morning in places like that. Stories about operators who worked beyond the margins, about a Canadian designated marksman who had been embedded with NATO-adjacent units across 3 decades and multiple theatres, a man whose confirmed work was so classified that his file had reportedly been moved off standard servers entirely. They called him Ironwood, the warrant had said, because he never bent, never broke, and if you were lucky enough to have him in your sector, you slept a lot better knowing it. Ashford had assumed it was legend, the kind of story that grows in the dark and the cold when men need to believe that excellence of that order is possible. "My warrant officer," Ashford said carefully, "served in Bosnia. He mentioned a Canadian designator who covered the Srebrenica corridor in '94. He said the man moved through that terrain for 6 weeks without resupply, without extraction. He said the only reason they knew he was there at all was because certain problems stopped happening in certain locations." He paused. He said the Canadians denied any involvement. Frank looked at him for a very long time. "Bosnia was complicated," Frank said. That was all he said. And somehow it was everything. Corporal Lefebvre and his group had gone completely quiet. Brisson had taken a step backward without appearing to realize it. The warehouse had done what warehouses do when something shifts in the human atmosphere inside them. It had become acoustically strange, sounds muffled, distance compressed. Ashford looked at the old man's hands. He had noticed the hands before weeks ago without quite registering what he was noticing. The knuckles, the way the tendons moved, the precision grip on the mop handle that was not the grip of a man who had spent his career pushing a mop, the hands of a shooter, the hands of someone who had held a rifle for so many thousands of hours that the muscle memory had permanently restructured the tissue. "Sir," Ashford said, and the word arrived with freight he hadn't planned to load it with. "You should know my warrant's name was Béliveau, Claude Béliveau, 2nd Platoon, 3rd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment." Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, slower, as though he was moving carefully through territory he hadn't crossed in years. "Béliveau," he said, "Quebec City kid, had a terrible poker face but could read a tree line better than anyone I ever worked with." Ashford exhaled. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. He retired in 2019, he said. He talks about guys he served with. He never named names. He just said there were people out there who never got the credit they were owed, and that Canada would never know what it didn't know. Frank looked down at his mop. Claude always was too philosophical for a man who couldn't finish a crossword puzzle, he said. And there it was, brief as a match flame, something that might have been the echo of warmth from another era. Lefebvre cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, and this time the word was entirely different from the one he had arrived with. "I apologize, I wasn't. I didn't know." Frank glanced at him. "You're young," he said. It was not an insult, it was a classification. Being young is not a flaw, it's a state. Most people grow out of it. He picked up his mop. "I'd suggest you use the time." Later that afternoon, Ashford called Claude Beliveau for the first time in 8 months. He told him what had happened and described the old man's face. There was a long silence on the line. Then Beliveau said something in French that Ashford didn't catch. Then, what was his first name? Frank, no last name on the badge. HR has a file somewhere. Another silence. "Dwayne," Beliveau said. "If that man is who I think he is, his full name is Francis Audet. And if he's mopping floors in Cold Lake, it's because he chose to. That man could have had a consulting career, commendations, speaking circuits. He chose the mop. You understand? He chose to disappear." Ashford looked out through the warehouse window at the parking lot where Frank's ancient pickup truck sat in the same spot it occupied every morning, a rust-worked grey F-150 that was older than some of the reservists who had been there today. "Why?" he asked. Beliveau was quiet for a moment. "Because the work he did," he said finally, "is not the kind of work that transitions easily into dinner party conversation. Some men come home and they build a new life on top of what they were. And some men, the ones who went deepest, they find that what they were doesn't leave room for much of anything else. So they find something quiet and honest, and they do it with the same standard they applied to everything, and they don't explain themselves to anyone." That evening, Ashford stayed late. He told Lepage he was catching up on inventory, which was partially true. At 6:15, when most of the crew had cleared out, he found Frank in the break room with a styrofoam cup of tea, reading a worn paperback that turned out, when Ashford got close enough to see the cover, to be a Pierre Berton history of the Canadian North. "Warrant Beliveau sends his regards," Ashford said. Frank looked up. He didn't seem surprised. Men who have spent their careers in intelligence are rarely surprised by anything. They've simply learned to perform surprise well enough to put other people at ease. "How's his knee?" Frank asked. "Better than mine." Frank almost smiled. "Sit down, Corporal. I'm not active anymore. I know. Sit down anyway." Ashford sat. For a while neither of them said anything. The warehouse settled around them, the sounds of a building exhaling after a long day, metal contracting in the November cold, the distant beep of a reversing vehicle outside. "You don't have to be here," Ashford said finally. "That's what Beliveau said. He said you chose this." "I did. Why Cold Lake?" Frank considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "I grew up about 2 hours north of here," he said. "My father worked the rigs. I know this cold. I know what it sounds like at 4 in the morning when the temperature drops below -30, and the only sound is the wind and the structure of the building working against itself." He paused. "That sound is honest. It doesn't ask you to be anything other than what you are." Ashford thought about that for a long time. He thought about Kandahar, about the heat that was its own kind of honesty, about the way certain environments clarified things. "Beliveau said you were in Bosnia," he said carefully. "He said other things too, but not on a phone call." Frank nodded slowly. He set his book face down on the table. "Claude talks too much," he said, but without any real disapproval. "He always did. It's why the card games went the way they went." "Were there others?" Ashford asked. "Other Canadians, in that period, doing what you were doing?" Frank looked at him steadily. "That's not a question I'll answer here or anywhere else," he said. "The answer would require me to speak about other people's choices, and that's not mine to do." "Fair," Ashford said. "What I will tell you," Frank said slowly, "is that this country did things in the 90s that required certain people to operate in conditions and under instructions that had no official existence. I'm not complaining. I understood the terms. Every man in my position understood the terms. You go in, you do the work, you come back if you come back, and the country you protected will never know your name." He picked up his tea. "That's not a tragedy. That was the agreement. But it costs something," Ashford said. "Living like that costs something." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Everything costs something, he said. The question is whether you made the right purchase. He picked up his book again, then he lowered it. Your knee, he said. ID or direct fire? ID, Ashford said. Panjwai District, 2017. Frank nodded. You're sleeping? Ashford thought about lying. He thought about it seriously, the way you consider a door before you open it. Then he didn't lie. Some nights, he said. Not all of them. That changes, Frank said. It takes longer than anyone tells you it will, and some nights it doesn't change at all, but the trend line is slow and it moves in the right direction. It just doesn't move in straight lines. He set down his cup. You get dogs? I have a dog. Lab mix named Constance. Good. Dogs understand things about silence that people don't. He stood up, a movement that was slower than it should have been, the left leg clearly the problem. Ashford noticed without commenting. Tell Claude I still owe him $40 from a poker game in Petawawa in 1989, and that I'll pay him when I feel like it. Ashford smiled. He'll be thrilled you remember. I remember everything, Frank said, without any particular inflection. He said it the way someone else might say they were left-handed, as a simple fact about the architecture of their existence. That's not always the advantage people assume it is. He picked up his mop from where he'd leaned it against the wall, pulled on his jacket, and headed for the door. He stopped once. Didn't turn around. You're a good soldier, Corporal Ashford, he said. Whatever you think about how you came home, the country got full value. He pushed through the exit into the cold lake dark. The story made its way through the distribution centre, the way stories do in contained communities, not loudly, not all at once, but thoroughly. Lepage heard it from Brisson, who had not stopped thinking about that afternoon since it happened. By the following week, it had reached the reserve unit 3 kilometres down the road. By the week after that, a retired infantry colonel, who lived in the area and had a son who worked receiving, had heard enough that he drove to the warehouse on a Tuesday morning just to see. He arrived at 5:30. Frank was already there, running a floor polisher down the main aisle. The colonel stood at the entrance for a long moment, watching. Then he walked over and stood to the side until the polisher passed, and Frank clicked it off. Francis Audet, the colonel said. Not a question. Frank looked at him. Douglas, he said. Not the colonel's rank, his first name. And the way he said it made clear that they had known each other somewhere, that ranks hadn't mattered. The colonel, whose full name was Douglas Carruthers, and who had been at CFB Gagetown in the 80s, put out his hand. Frank shook it. Then Carruthers, retired colonel of 31 years of service, came to attention and saluted, crisp and complete, the salute you reserve for something more than rank, the salute you give to a reckoning. Frank returned it with a precision that the floor polisher and the years had not touched. They talk about you, Carruthers said, in the schools, not by name. But the instructors talk about a certain operator who worked the Balkans without any support structure for extended periods. They use it as a benchmark, a thing people point at when they want to describe what is theoretically possible theoretically, Frank said. Yes. Carruthers held his gaze. Is there anything you need? Anything the system failed to? I have what I need, Frank said simply. I have the work and the cold and enough left over to buy a bad paperback once a week. He glanced at the floor polisher. I'm behind on my corridor. Carruthers nodded. He stepped aside, watched the old man restart the machine and continue down the aisle with the same economy of motion, the same standard of attention applied to 37 cents worth of floor polish, as had once been applied to operations that no government document would acknowledge for another 30 years. At the far end of the corridor, Frank turned the machine at the wall and began coming back. He didn't look up, but as he passed Carruthers, he said, without stopping, "Tell them to get the benchmarks right. I wasn't alone. The sons who made what I did possible were better than me. They just had the decency to be even harder to find." He kept going. Carruthers stood there for another minute, alone in the warehouse, with the sound of the floor polisher and the cold lake, cold pressing against the walls. Outside, in the parking lot, a corporal and 2 junior privates from the reserve unit down the road were sitting in a car that had technically been parked there for a personnel matter, and had somewhat coincidentally been there for 45 minutes waiting to see if the stories were true. When Carruthers emerged, they looked at him. "Is it him?" one of them asked. Carruthers put on his gloves. "Drive carefully," he said. "The roads are iced past the fuel depot." He walked to his car. They took that as a yes. Ashford heard the rest of it in February, when Beliveau finally came to Cold Lake to visit his sister and stopped at the warehouse on a grey Thursday morning. The two men stood by the loading dock while Beliveau told him, quietly and carefully, about the operation in Bosnia that Frank would never describe himself. About the 3 weeks that certain officers in certain briefing rooms still referred to by a code name that had been retired from use because no situation since had warranted it. About a Canadian operator who had single-handedly maintained a surveillance corridor that allowed a UN convoy to move through territory that 3 different assessments had declared impassable, had maintained it for 19 days with one resupply drop that had missed its mark by 4 kilometers, and had come out of it having never fired a single shot because his precision and his patience had made every situation resolve before it required one. "He didn't fire a shot," Ashford said. "Not one," Beliveau said. "He moved, he watched, he fed information that allowed other people to make decisions that prevented the engagement entirely. The whole point was that if he did his job right, nobody would ever know he was there." He paused. He did his job exactly right. Ashford thought about that for a while. He thought about the difference between the violence of action and the violence of restraint, about which one demanded more. "He should have medals," he said. "He has medals," Beliveau said. "They're just in a government file that he signed a form not to discuss. He zipped his jacket higher against the wind off the lake. He knows what he did. That was always enough for him. The recognition was never the point." He glanced back toward the warehouse. The point was the mission. 3 weeks after that, Ashford arrived at 5:15 in the morning to find the warehouse unlocked, but Frank not at his usual post near the east corridor. Lepage came in at 5:30 looking grim. He pulled Ashford aside. Francis Audet had been found unresponsive in his truck in the parking lot the previous evening. The paramedics said it was cardiac. He would have known it was coming, they said. Men of his age with his medical history usually knew. He had driven himself to the parking lot of the place he worked. He had turned off the engine, and he had sat there in his usual spot in the Cold Lake dark, and he had not called anyone, and he had not tried to drive to the hospital, and he had not made it complicated for anyone who would have to follow after. He had a phone in his jacket pocket. There were 3 contacts: Lepage, a sister in Timmins, and Ashford. He had not called any of them. Whether that was a final act of discipline or a final act of privacy, Ashford spent a long time deciding where and eventually concluded it was probably both. The funeral was a small thing by anyone's measure. The sister flew in from Timmins. Lepage came and most of the warehouse crew. Beliveau drove 9 hours. Carruthers arrived without announcement and stood at the back in a dark coat, not in uniform, which Ashford thought was a more deliberate choice than the uniform would have been. The coffin was draped with a Canadian flag. There was no official military ceremony. Frank's paperwork was complicated in ways that required months to untangle classifications and redactions and forms that referenced other forms. But the 6 men who carried the coffin, 3 of them veterans, 2 of them reservists who had heard the story from Lefebvre's group, and Ashford, who had known him longest of any of them, all moved with the kind of precision that didn't require rehearsal. They had all been trained to carry things carefully. Ashford did not prepare remarks. He stood at the front of the small room in the funeral home and said what he knew. He said that he had known Francis Audet for 4 months and not known who he was for most of that time, which he suspected Francis would have considered the arrangement working exactly as intended. He said that the man had applied the same standard to a warehouse floor that he had apparently applied to operations that would not be declassified in either of their lifetimes. He said that he had once asked the man what he thought about in the quiet in the pre-dawn hours when the warehouse was empty and the only sound was Cold Lake pressing against the building, and Frank had told him he thought mostly about the guys who had done the job right and never got thanked for it. Not himself, them, he said. Some people carry things so that other people don't have to know the weight. That is not a tragedy. It is a specific kind of love for a country that will never fully understand what was offered on its behalf. He said. Francis Audet kept his word to the end. He stepped back. Carruthers, in his dark coat at the back of the room, did not come to attention. He simply lowered his head, which, given who he was and what he knew, meant more than any salute. The warehouse named the early shift, the 5 a.m. crew that arrived before the Cold Lake dark had fully lifted, the Audet shift. Nobody voted on it. Lepage just started calling it that one morning, and nobody disagreed. and Corporal Dwayne Ashford, who was not sleeping all nights, but was sleeping more of them, who had called his mother twice in February and his physiotherapist once, and Beliveau 3 times, who had a dog named Constance, who understood silence in ways that people did, still arrived at 5:15 every morning and still nodded at the East Corridor when he came in. He wasn't nodding at nothing. He was acknowledging a standard, a thing that had been done here, quietly and without complaint, by someone who had no reason left to prove anything to anyone, who had chosen to show up anyway, every day, in the cold and the dark, because the floor needed doing, and because Francis Audet was the kind of man who did what needed doing, whether or not anyone was watching, especially when no one was watching. If you've ever known someone like that, someone who carried more than they showed and gave more than they took, leave a comment. Those stories deserve to be heard. Subscribe to Echoes of Courage. We'll keep telling them.